The inspector had heard Emily's story by that time, and so he asked her if she couldn't be mistaken. Looking down from a third-story window, he said, "People look different, you know, Peggy." "I'd know that old Panama of his anywhere," she said stubbornly. "Lots of men wear old Panamas." Was there nothing else? He was getting out his keys. "I saw him as plain as I see you. Besides," she added triumphantly, "anybody else but Mr. Wellington would have had to ring the doorbell, and it didn't ring. It rings on the third floor as well as in the kitchen." But there is to Peggy's credit the fact that she then set her small and pretty chin, and that she said nothing more about Jim until she was recalled later that night. That was after Emily had remembered that Jim had spoken to me in the garden, and they brought the girl in, anxious and with reddened eyes, and inquired if the man she had seen on the walk could not have been Jim Wellington. She shook her head obstinately, but they kept at her, and at last she admitted that she had seen Jim that afternoon. Where? On the walk? No. In the house. On the second floor. And then seeing the inspector's expression, she burst into a flood of tears. But of course she had to go on, and at last they had a fairly coherent story from her. Shortly before 4, feeling comforted by Margaret's visit, she decided to go out after all. She did not know the precise time. She put on her hat and went down to the second floor, where in one of the guest rooms there was a better mirror. She fixed her hat there, and then went out into the hall. On her way to the back stairs, however, she heard someone coming up the front staircase and saw that it was Jim Wellington. He was bareheaded, and he was coming up quietly, but without any particular stealth. Of one thing she was certain. He was empty-handed. He did not see her, but passed the landing and went on up toward the main part of the house. Certainly his presence there did not surprise her. He always had the run of the house, she said, rather naively. She had not seen or heard him go out. She herself had gone on down the back stairs, and she was there with Ellen and Jenny when the alarm was raised. Not in 1,000 years would she believe Mr. Wellington committed the crime. He wouldn't hurt a fly, and she didn't care what anybody thought. "So there we are," said the inspector, summarizing the case later on. Wellington had been in the house and slipped away, and old Mr. Lancaster had pulled a fake alibi on us. But if this girl was right, The old gentleman came back at 25 minutes to 4, and at a quarter to 4 or about that Miss Emily finds her mother all right and goes to dress. At 4 she discovers what has happened, and not more than 10 minutes after 4 Eben meets the old gentleman on his way in at the gates, immaculate and not in a hurry, apparently on his way home, and not more than 5 or 10 minutes past his usual schedule. I don't mind telling you that when I got home at 3 o'clock that morning I took a triple bromide. Chapter 8. I suppose some of the Crescent people went to bed that night. That some of the women stood before their old-fashioned bureaus, stuck their brooches into their fat pincushions, unhooked dresses and hung them up, slid off petticoats, unpinned false curls and braids and put them neatly into their boxes, unhooked their tight lace stays and unbuttoned their tight shoes, and having got so far, modestly slipped their nightgowns over their heads and then removed the remainder of their clothing. Or that some of the men also retired, after taking a final nightcap or two, the material for which rumor reported that our chauffeur, Holmes, surreptitiously supplied at a profit. They had had the first real thrill of many years, and now behind them, visible in the mirrors before which they brushed their hair or took off their collars, were their wide beds with their bolsters, opened and waiting for them, the starched linen pillow shams of the day laid aside, the day spreads neatly folded and the night spreads as neatly in place. The single bed had no place on the Crescent. Looking back, I can see them all with an understanding I lacked at the time. I can see Mrs. Talbot, attended by her faithful Lizzie, removing one of the black transformations which she wore rather as other women wear a hat, and of which she claimed to have a half-dozen or so. I can see Lydia taking off her pads and hanging them up in a window to dry after the hot day. I have seen them there myself, early in the morning. I can see Emily Lancaster, filled with who knows what horrors, asleep at last after the Crescent physician, Dr. Armstrong, had given her an opiate, and Margaret walking the floor of the morning room downstairs while police overran the house, listening for any approach to the library and the old couch there, where far down under the upholstery she had hidden something which she must somehow get out of the house. And downtown, in an office in the City Hall, I can see Jim Wellington sitting in a hard chair and being questioned, his key to the Lancaster house on the desk, the commissioner behind the desk, and the district attorney walking the floor and smoking one cigarette after another. What time was it when Miss Margaret Lancaster telephoned you? Between 11 and 12. Perhaps a little later. And what did she say? She said her father wanted me to go over the chest and see what was in it. A chest? What chest? Jim was astonished. Then they haven't told you? The chest under my aunt's bed. She had developed a nervous terror of banks, and she'd been turning her fortune into gold and currency for some months. Mostly gold. After that he had to explain the entire procedure, and they listened spellbound.